The gold band slipped from Margaret Parker's trembling fingers into the pawnbroker's calloused palm, and she felt her heart break all over again as surely as it had the day they buried Thomas 3 months prior. The dusty streets of Opal, Montana stretched outside the grimy window of Henderson's Pawn and Trade, the August heat of 1883 making the air shimmer like water over the rutted dirt roads. Margaret pressed her lips together, willing herself not to cry as Mr. Henderson examined the simple wedding ring through his jeweler's loupe, turning it this way and that in the weak afternoon light. "It is not much, Mrs. Parker," he said finally, his tone apologetic but firm. "Plain gold, no stones. I can give you $12 for it." $12. The sum seemed impossibly small for something that had meant the world to her. Margaret thought of the day Thomas had placed it on her finger in the little church back in Ohio, his face bright with hope and promise. They had been so young then, just 20 and 18, certain that their love and determination could conquer anything the frontier had to offer. "That will be sufficient," Margaret heard herself say, though the words felt like they belonged to someone else. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." The pawnbroker counted out the bills with practiced efficiency, then added a few coins. $12.50. I rounded up a bit. His eyes, kind despite the hardness of his profession, met hers. "You take care now, Mrs. Parker. These are difficult times." Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice, and tucked the money carefully into her reticule. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the ring one last time, sitting on the black velvet cloth on Henderson's counter, looking impossibly small and lost. Then she stepped out into the heat and dust of the Montana summer, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her 21 years. The general store was 3 buildings down, past the saloon where rough laughter spilled into the street, and the land office where men gathered to argue about water rights and grazing boundaries. Margaret kept her eyes downcast, knowing that her threadbare black morning dress and thin frame marked her as a woman in dire straits. She had felt the pitying looks for weeks now, had heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. "Poor thing," they said. "Husband dead from typhoid fever, no family out here, that little homestead barely scratching by even when Thomas was alive. Whatever will she do?" Margaret lifted her chin a fraction higher. She would survive. That was what she would do. She would buy flour and beans and salt pork with her $12.50, and she would make it last as long as possible. She would tend her small vegetable garden and the 3 chickens that still produced eggs, and she would figure out a way forward. She had to. The bell above the door of Morrison's General Store chimed as she entered, and the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and tobacco washed over her. Mrs. Morrison looked up from where she was arranging bolts of fabric, her expression immediately shifting to one of concern. "Margaret, dear. How are you managing?" "Well enough, thank you." Margaret moved toward the shelves of dry goods, trying to calculate in her head how far she could stretch her meager funds. "I need to purchase some supplies." She spent 20 minutes carefully selecting the most economical items, weighing each choice against her dwindling resources. 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of beans, a small slab of salt pork, a cone of sugar, a tin of lard. She added a paper of pins and a cake of soap, then reluctantly set them back. Those were luxuries she could not afford. Mrs. Morrison tallied the purchases with a sympathetic expression. "That comes to $8.30. Margaret counted out the money, trying not to think about how quickly it disappeared. $4.20 left. It would have to be enough. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison." "Margaret, wait." The older woman reached beneath the counter and produced the soap and pins Margaret had set back. "Please take these. Consider them a gift. pride warred with necessity in Margaret's chest. "I cannot accept charity, Mrs. Morrison. You have been kind enough already." "It is not charity, child. It is neighborliness." Mrs. Morrison pressed the items into Margaret's hands. "We women must look after one another out here. The frontier is hard enough without going it alone." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Truly." She left the store with her purchases wrapped in brown paper, the weight of them solid in her arms but doing nothing to ease the hollowness in her chest where her wedding ring used to rest. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Margaret began the long walk back to her homestead, 2 miles outside of town on a patch of land that Thomas had been so proud to claim. The road was dusty and rutted from the summer drought, and Margaret had to stop twice to rest and shift her parcels. Her shoes were wearing thin at the soles, and she could feel every stone through the leather. Another expense she could not afford to address. She was so focused on placing her feet carefully and maintaining her grip on her packages that she did not hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. "Madam, Mrs. Parker." Margaret looked up, shading her eyes against the lowering sun. The man on horseback was tall and rangy, sitting easy in his saddle atop a handsome bay gelding. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, his hat dusty from long days on the range, but there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested capability and quiet confidence. She recognized him vaguely from town, though they had never been properly introduced. "I am sorry to startle you, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I am Jack Sullivan. I work for the Rockingham Ranch north of your property. I have seen you walking this road before, Mr. Sullivan." Margaret nodded politely, unsure what else to say. "It is a long walk back to your place, especially carrying all that." He swung down from his horse with fluid grace. "Would you permit me to offer you a ride? I am headed that direction regardless." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She barely knew this man, and propriety suggested she should not accept such an offer. But her arms ached, her feet hurt, and the prospect of walking another 1.5 miles in her worn shoes was suddenly overwhelming. "That would be very kind, Mr. Sullivan. Thank you." His face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features, making him seem younger than she had first thought. Perhaps 25 or 26, with the sun-creased eyes of a man who spent his life outdoors. "Happy to help, madam." He took her packages and secured them carefully in his saddlebags, then helped her mount the bay. The horse stood patient and steady as Margaret settled herself side-saddle, trying not to think about how long it had been since she had ridden. Thomas had sold their only horse 2 weeks before he died, trying to raise money for the doctor who ultimately could do nothing to save him. Jack swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance even as he gathered the reins. "Just hold on, madam. We will take it nice and easy." The bay moved forward at a gentle walk, and Margaret found herself acutely aware of Jack's presence behind her, solid and warm in the cooling evening air. She caught the scent of leather and sage, horse and honest sweat, and something about it made her chest tighten with a loneliness so profound it took her breath away. "I was sorry to hear about your husband, Mrs. Parker," Jack said quietly after a few minutes of silence. "Thomas was a good man. We spoke a few times at the feed store. He was always friendly, always willing to share what he knew about farming in this country." "Thank you," Margaret managed. "He did his best. We both did." "That is all anyone can do out here." Jack paused. "How are you managing, if you do not mind my asking?" Margaret considered deflecting, maintaining the polite fiction that everything was fine. But there was something in Jack's tone, a genuine concern that had nothing to do with pity or nosiness, that made her answer honestly. I am managing one day at a time, Mr. Sullivan. Today I had to sell my wedding ring to buy food. Tomorrow I will figure out what comes next. She felt him tense behind her, though his voice remained steady. That must have been a difficult choice. It was necessary. Margaret blinked hard against the tears that threatened. I cannot eat sentiment, and I have to survive. You are a strong woman, Mrs. Parker. I am a desperate one. There is a difference. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clop of the horses' hooves and the evening chorus of crickets beginning in the grass. The sun sank lower, streaking the sky with deepening shades of orange and purple. Despite everything, Margaret found herself noticing the beauty of it, the vast Montana sky that had so captivated Thomas when they first arrived. "Which pawnbroker did you use?" Jack asked suddenly. "If you do not mind my asking." "Mr. Henderson on Main Street." "Why? Just curious. I have dealt with him before. He is honest, at least, which is more than can be said for some." Margaret's small homestead came into view. The rough cabin Thomas had built from logs and determination. The small barn that housed her chickens and precious little else. The garden plot where she coaxed vegetables from the stubborn soil. It looked lonely and forsaken in the dying light, and Margaret felt her courage falter for just a moment before she steeled herself again. Jack helped her down from the horse, his hands gentle and respectful at her waist, then retrieved her packages from the saddlebags. He walked with her to the cabin door, his eyes taking in the sagging porch rail and the places where the chinking had fallen out between the logs. "Mrs. Parker, if you need any help with repairs or anything else, please do not hesitate to send word to the Rockingham. I would be happy to lend a hand." Margaret looked at him, this kind stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to ease her burden if only for a little while. "Why would you do that, Mr. Sullivan? You do not know me." He met her eyes, his own dark and honest in the gathering dusk. "Because out here we help each other when we can. And because no one should have to face this country alone. Thank you for the ride and for the offer. You are welcome, madam." He touched his hat again, then mounted the bay in one smooth motion. "You take care now." Margaret watched him ride away until horse and rider disappeared into the twilight, then turned to enter her empty cabin. The darkness inside seemed to press in on her as she lit the lamp, throwing shadows into the corners where Thomas's absence loomed largest. She put away her purchases, moving through the familiar motions mechanically, her mind far away. Her left hand felt wrong without the weight of her ring. She kept touching the bare finger, feeling the slight indentation where the gold band had rested for 3 years. Such a small thing, really, and yet its absence felt enormous. Margaret prepared herself a simple supper of cornbread and the last of her beans, ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table alone was too painful, then cleaned up and prepared for bed. The nights were the hardest, when the silence pressed down and she could almost hear Thomas's voice, almost feel his presence beside her. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind whisper around the cabin eaves, and tried to imagine a future that held anything beyond mere survival. But tonight, exhausted and heartsick, she could see nothing but the long, empty days stretching ahead. Morning came too soon, announced by the rooster who lived with her 3 hens. Margaret rose stiff and unrested, splashed water on her face from the basin, and dressed in one of her 2 everyday dresses. The morning black hung in the corner, too warm for working but a statement she felt obligated to make when she went to town. The garden needed weeding, and 2 of the fence posts around the chicken yard were loose. Margaret spent the morning working in the fierce sun, trying not to think about how Thomas would have fixed the posts properly, would have known exactly how to shore them up so they would last. She did her best with the tools and knowledge she had, aware that her solutions were temporary at best. By noon, the heat drove her inside, and she allowed herself a small meal of bread and an egg from the morning's collection. 4 eggs today, which meant she could trade a dozen in town by the end of the week if production held. The chickens, at least, were reliable. She was washing her plate when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Margaret dried her hands and went to the door, shading her eyes against the midday glare. A buckboard was pulling into her yard, and her heart sank as she recognized Cyrus Blackwell at the reins. Blackwell owned the largest ranch in the territory, thousands of acres stretching north and west of Opal. He was a man of wealth and influence, somewhere in his mid-40s, with cold eyes and a reputation for getting what he wanted. He had approached Thomas twice about buying their homestead, offering insultingly low prices both times. Thomas had refused, determined to make their small farm succeed. Mrs. Parker, Blackwell said, climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in a saddle. I hope I am not disturbing you. Mr. Blackwell, what can I do for you? I wanted to pay my respects, first of all. Your husband's death was a tragedy. Typhoid is a terrible thing. His expression was appropriately somber, but his eyes remained calculating. And I wanted to make you an offer. Margaret's spine stiffened. What kind of offer? I would like to purchase your land, Mrs. Parker. I am prepared to offer you $200 for the property, the cabin, and all outbuildings. It is a fair price, more than fair given the condition of things. $200. It was more money than Margaret had ever seen at one time, enough to buy passage back east and start over somewhere less harsh. But it was also far less than the land was worth, far less than what Thomas had invested in sweat and hope. This is my home, Mr. Blackwell. I am not interested in selling. His expression hardened slightly. Mrs. Parker, please be reasonable. You are a woman alone on a failing homestead. You sold your wedding ring yesterday just to buy food. How much longer do you think you can last out here? The fact that he knew about the ring sent a chill down Margaret's spine. How many people had heard about her desperate sale? How many were talking about her situation? That is my concern, not yours. I am trying to help you. Blackwell's tone took on an edge of impatience. Take the money, go back east where you have family and opportunities. This country is no place for a woman on her own. Thank you for your offer, Mr. Blackwell, but my answer is no. They stood in the dooryard, locked in a silent battle of wills. Blackwell was the first to look away, his jaw tight with frustration. You are being foolish, Mrs. Parker. Pride is a poor substitute for practical sense. Perhaps, but it is my choice to make. He climbed back into his wagon, gathering the reins with short, angry movements. When you change your mind, and you will, my offer will still stand. For now, but it will not last forever. Margaret watched him drive away, her heart pounding. She knew she had made an enemy, knew that Blackwell was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully. But the thought of giving up the land that Thomas had loved, that he had died trying to make productive, was unbearable. She went back inside, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. $200. It would solve so many problems, and yet the price felt like a betrayal of everything she and Thomas had tried to build together. The afternoon passed slowly, and as the shadows began to lengthen again, Margaret found herself thinking about Jack Sullivan. She wondered if he had made it back to the Rockingham safely, wondered if he thought about their encounter at all, or if helping stranded women was simply something he did without a second thought. She was preparing a simple supper when she heard another horse approach. This time her visitor was Jack himself, sitting easy in the saddle and leading a second horse, a sturdy-looking roan mare. "Good evening, Mrs. Parker," he called, dismounting. "I hope I am not intruding. Mr. Sullivan, what brings you out here?" He walked toward her, leading both horses, and Margaret noticed he was carrying something in his other hand. As he drew closer, she saw it was a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I had some business in town this afternoon," Jack said, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "And I happened to stop by Henderson's pawn shop." Margaret's breath caught as Jack held out the package. She knew, somehow, what it contained before she even opened it. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the paper to reveal a small velvet box. Inside, nestled in faded satin, was her wedding ring. "You bought it back," she whispered. "Yes, madam. I hope you do not mind. It seemed wrong somehow for you to have to part with it." Margaret stared at the ring, emotions flooding through her so fast and fierce she could barely process them. Relief, gratitude, embarrassment, something else she could not quite name. "Mr. Sullivan, I cannot accept this. You spent your own money." "It is already done, Mrs. Parker. The ring is yours again, as it should be. But I sold it for a reason. I needed the money for food, and I still do. Taking this back does not change my circumstances." Jack shifted his weight, looking suddenly uncertain. "I know that, which is why I brought the mare as well." Margaret looked at the roan horse, confused. "I do not understand." "She is a good horse, steady and willing. You could use her to get to town easier, to work the land better. And I was hoping you might consider a business arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "The rocking M needs someone to take in laundry, do some sewing and mending. The Cowboys are hard on their clothes, and we are always needing repairs. I spoke to my boss, Mr. Morrison, and he said if you were willing, we could send work your way. It would not make you rich, but it would provide steady income." Margaret's mind raced. Laundry and mending were skills she possessed, work she could do from home. It was honest labor, nothing to be ashamed of, and it would allow her to keep her land. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not even know me." Jack met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that made her heart skip. "Maybe I would like to change that, and maybe I know what it is like to struggle, to need a hand up instead of a handout. My parents died when I was 17, Mrs. Parker. Left me and my younger sister with nothing but debts. If folks had not helped us then, had not given us chances to work and earn our way, I do not know what would have become of us. Where is your sister now?" "Teaching school in Denver. Married to a good man, 2 children. She is happy." Margaret looked at the ring in her hand, then at Jack, then at the mare waiting patiently beside his bay. Every instinct she had told her this was too much, too generous, that there must be some catch or expectation attached. But when she looked into Jack's eyes, she saw only honest kindness. "I will accept the work," she said slowly, "and I will pay you back for the ring a little at a time from what I earn. As for the mare, I will consider her a loan until I can afford to purchase a horse of my own." Jack nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That seems fair. But there is one more thing, if you will permit me." "What is that?" He stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, and held out his hand. "May I?" Confused, Margaret placed her hand in his. Jack took the ring from the box with his other hand, and with movements that were surprisingly gentle for such work-roughened fingers, he slipped it back onto her finger. The gold band settled into its familiar groove, and Margaret felt tears spill over before she could stop them. "There," Jack said softly. "That is where it belongs." Margaret could not speak, could only stand there with tears running down her face while this kind stranger held her hand and gave her back a piece of her heart she thought was lost forever. When she finally found her voice, it came out rough and broken. "Thank you. I do not know how I will ever properly thank you." "No thanks needed, Mrs. Parker. Just promise me you will not give up on your homestead. Do not let Blackwell or anyone else run you off your land." Margaret looked at him sharply. "How did you know about Blackwell?" "I saw his wagon leaving as I was riding out, and I know how he operates. He has been trying to buy up all the small holdings in the area, pressuring folks when they are vulnerable. Do not let him intimidate you." "I already refused him once today." "Good." Jack released her hand, stepping back. "Now let me show you about the mare. Her name is Rosie, and she is as gentle as they come." He spent the next half hour teaching Margaret about the horse's habits and preferences, showing her where Rosie liked to be scratched and how she responded to voice commands. The mare was indeed gentle, nuzzling Margaret's shoulder with soft horse breath, patient when Margaret fumbled with the unfamiliar tack. "I will bring the first load of mending out tomorrow," Jack said as he prepared to leave. "If that suits you." "That would be fine. And Mr. Sullivan." "Thank you for everything. You are welcome, Mrs. Parker, and please call me Jack. Then you must call me Margaret." He smiled again, that transforming smile that made him seem younger and less careworn. "Good evening, Margaret." "Good evening, Jack." She watched him ride away into the gathering dusk, then looked down at her left hand where the wedding ring gleamed in the lamplight. It felt right there, felt like a piece of herself restored. But as she turned to go inside, she realized with a start that, when Jack had slipped it onto her finger, the gesture had felt different from when Thomas had done the same thing 3 years ago. Not wrong exactly, but charged with a different kind of meaning that she was not quite ready to examine. Margaret pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the practical matter of settling Rosie in the small barn. The mare nickered softly to the chickens, who regarded her with suspicious chicken eyes before returning to their roost. Margaret forked hay into the empty stall, filled the water bucket from the well, and made sure Rosie had everything she needed. That night, for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret went to bed feeling something other than despair. It was not quite hope, not yet, but it was possibility. The ring on her finger was a reminder that not everything was lost, that kindness still existed in this hard country, that perhaps she could find a way to survive after all. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Margaret was up early to tend the garden and gather eggs. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard a wagon approaching. Jack drove the buckboard himself, a large basket covered with oilcloth secured in the back. "Good morning," he called, pulling the horses to a stop. "I brought the mending." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and came to meet him. "That is quite a load. 3 months' worth, if I am honest. The boys have been letting it pile up." Jack lifted the basket down, and Margaret could see shirts and trousers, socks and undergarments, all in various states of disrepair. "I told Mr. Morrison you were taking this on, and he said to tell you to charge whatever is fair for your labor. He knows good work is worth paying for." They carried the basket inside, and Margaret began sorting through the items, making mental notes of what needed doing. Buttons, patches, torn seams, a few items that would need more extensive repair. "This will take me a few days," she said. "Is that acceptable?" "Take whatever time you need. We are not going anywhere." Jack paused, looking around the cabin's simple interior. "Would you permit me to fix that porch rail while I am here? I noticed yesterday it was coming loose." Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of independence, but practical sense won out over pride. "That would be helpful, thank you. The tools are in the barn." While Jack worked on the porch, Margaret made coffee and brought him a cup. He accepted it gratefully, taking a long drink before setting it aside to continue his work. "You have a nice place here," he said, hammering a nail into place. "Good soil, decent water." Thomas chose well when he filed the claim. He loved this land, saw its potential even when I could only see how hard everything was. Margaret sat on the step, cradling her own coffee cup. I was not cut out for frontier life, I do not think. I grew up in Cincinnati, in a house with wallpaper and real floors. My father was a pharmacist. I had never even seen a chicken before we came west. Jack smiled at that. And now you raise them. 3 reliable layers and 1 rooster with delusions of grandeur. Not quite the farming empire Thomas envisioned, but they keep me in eggs. What made you come west? Thomas's dreams. He wanted land of his own, wanted to build something from nothing. I wanted to make him happy. Margaret stared into her coffee. I did not realize until after he was gone that I had stopped having dreams of my own somewhere along the way. I just followed his. That does not make you weak, Margaret. It makes you loyal or foolish. No. Jack set down his hammer, turning to face her fully. You left everything you knew to support your husband's ambitions. You learned skills that were foreign to you, adapted to a life that was nothing like what you were raised for. And now that he is gone, you are fighting to keep the dream alive even though it was never really yours to begin with. That is not foolish. That is courage. Margaret felt her throat tighten. No one had talked to her like this since Thomas died, treating her like a person with her own thoughts and feelings rather than just a pitiable widow to be managed and directed. Some days I want to burn it all down and run back to Ohio, she admitted. Just give up and admit defeat. But you have not. No, I have not. Then you are stronger than you think. They worked in companionable silence for the rest of the morning, Jack repairing the porch and checking the barn roof while Margaret started on the mending. She found the work soothing, the familiar rhythm of needle through fabric, the satisfaction of making something whole that had been broken. Jack left around noon, promising to return in a few days to check her progress and see if she needed anything. Margaret watched him go, then returned to her sewing with renewed energy. For the first time in months, she felt useful, felt like she had purpose beyond simply surviving one more day. The week passed quickly. Margaret worked through the pile of mending, her fingers growing sore but her spirits lifting with each completed item. She was good at this work, she realized. Her stitches were neat and even her patches carefully matched to the original fabric. It was something she could take pride in. Jack returned 3 days later, this time bringing fresh vegetables from the ranch garden and a slab of bacon that made Margaret's mouth water just looking at it. Mr. Morrison sends these with his compliments, Jack said, setting the items on the table. He said anyone doing work for the ranch should not go hungry. This is too much. It is payment, Margaret. You are providing a service, we are compensating you. There is no charity in it. Put that way, Margaret could accept the gifts without feeling diminished. She showed Jack the completed mending, neat stacks of repaired clothing that looked almost new. This is excellent work, Jack said, examining a patched shirt with an expert eye. The boys will be pleased. I am glad. When shall I expect the next load? I will bring it next week. But today, I was hoping you might let me take you into town. You mentioned trading eggs, and I need to pick up supplies anyway. Margaret hesitated. Being seen riding into Opal with Jack Sullivan would certainly start tongues wagging. But she did need to trade her eggs, and the trip would be much easier with the wagon than trying to walk while carrying a basket. All right, she said finally. Let me gather the eggs and change my dress. She put on her better day dress, not quite morning black but a somber gray that seemed appropriate. When she emerged from the cabin, Jack was waiting by the wagon, and the look in his eyes when he saw her made her heart skip strangely. You look lovely, he said simply, then helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ride into Opal took less than half an hour, and Margaret found herself enjoying the journey despite her nervousness about gossip. Jack was easy to talk to, sharing stories about life on the Rockingham, asking her opinion on everything from the drought to the territorial politics that dominated the local newspaper. "You read much?" he asked. "I used to before we came west." There was not much room for books in the wagon, and I have not had the money to buy new ones since we arrived. The Rocking M has a small library. Mr. Morrison's wife was a great reader before she passed, and her books are still there. You would be welcome to borrow from them any time. "I would like that very much." They reached Opal to find the town bustling with Saturday activity. Jack helped Margaret down from the wagon, then walked with her to the general store where Mrs. Morrison greeted them both warmly. "Margaret, dear, and Jack, how nice to see you. What brings you both to town?" "Mrs. Parker has eggs to trade," Jack said easily. "And I need to pick up supplies for the ranch." Mrs. Morrison's eyes flicked between them, shrewd and assessing, but her smile remained warm. "Well, let us see what you have, Margaret." The trading went smoothly, and Margaret left with a credit against future purchases that would allow her to buy the soap and other necessities she had been putting off. As she and Jack were leaving the store, they nearly collided with Cyrus Blackwell on the boardwalk. "Mrs. Parker," Blackwell said, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jack at her side. "Sullivan, how unexpected to see you together." "Mr. Blackwell." Margaret kept her voice cool and polite. "I trust you have given more thought to my offer, Mrs. Parker." "I have not, as my answer remains unchanged." Blackwell's expression hardened. "That is unfortunate. I would hate to see you struggle unnecessarily. A woman alone can face all sorts of difficulties out here. Accidents happen." The veiled threat hung in the air between them. Before Margaret could respond, Jack stepped forward, his posture deceptively relaxed but his voice carrying an edge of steel. "Mrs. Parker is not alone, Blackwell. She has friends and neighbors who look out for her. It would be wise to remember that." "I am merely expressing concern for a vulnerable widow, Sullivan. Surely you cannot fault me for that." "I can fault you for trying to pressure and intimidate her. Mrs. Parker has made her position clear. A gentleman would accept that and move on." Blackwell's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might say something more. But several townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation, and Blackwell was too conscious of his reputation to make a scene on Main Street. "Good day, Mrs. Parker. Sullivan." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and strode away, his back rigid with anger. Margaret released a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you for that. I do not think he would have accepted another refusal gracefully if you had not been here. He is a bully, Margaret. And bullies back down when someone stands up to them." Jack touched her elbow gently. "Are you all right?" "Yes, just shaken. Did you hear what he said about accidents?" "I did, and I meant what I said. You are not alone in this. If Blackwell or any of his men come around your place making trouble, you send Rosie straight to the Rockingham. We are less than an hour's ride away." The concern in his voice, the protective stance of his body, made something warm unfurl in Margaret's chest. She looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice, and felt a rush of gratitude so intense it made her dizzy. "You have been so kind to me, Jack. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me." His voice was soft, and his hand was still at her elbow, warm through the fabric of her dress. "I just want to see you safe and able to keep your home." They stood like that for a moment, awareness crackling between them like heat lightning, until Mrs. Morrison called from the store doorway. "Margaret, I forgot to give you the mail. There is a letter here for you." The spell broken, Margaret stepped back and went to collect the envelope Mrs. Morrison held out. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and when she checked the return address, her heart sank. It was from Thomas's brother in Pennsylvania, a man she had never met but who Thomas had spoken of occasionally. She tucked the letter into her reticule to read later and helped Jack load the ranch supplies into the wagon. The drive back to her homestead was quieter than the trip into town. Both of them lost in thought when they arrived. Jack carried her purchases inside and then lingered by the door, hat in hand. "Margaret, I know this might not be my place to say, but please be careful. Blackwell is not a man who takes rejection well, and he has the money and influence to cause real trouble. I will be careful, and I will send for help if I need it. Promise me." The intensity in his voice made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. This was not just neighborly concern or abstract kindness. Jack cared about her specifically, personally, in a way that went beyond simple good manners. "I promise," she said softly. He nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "I will see you next week with more mending." After he left, Margaret sat at the table and opened the letter from Thomas's brother. The contents were brief and to the point. Edward Parker had heard of Thomas's death through a mutual acquaintance and wanted to express his condolences. He also wanted to know if Margaret intended to maintain the homestead or if she would be willing to sell. He had a buyer in mind who would pay fair market value, and he would be happy to facilitate the transaction for a small fee. Margaret set the letter aside with a bitter laugh. Everyone, it seemed, wanted her to give up and leave. Her husband's own brother, who had never bothered to visit or even write when Thomas was alive, now appeared offering to help her sell the land Thomas had loved. She looked around the simple cabin, at the rough furniture Thomas had built, the iron stove they had scraped together money to buy, the window with its view of the mountains he had found so inspiring. This place was all she had left of her marriage, of the hopes and dreams that had brought them west. Giving it up felt like erasing Thomas from existence entirely. But keeping it meant struggling against forces she barely understood, against men like Blackwell who saw her as an obstacle to be removed, against a land that was unforgiving of mistakes or weakness. Could she really do this alone? The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, and Margaret thought of Jack slipping it back onto her hand, his touch gentle and reverent. "You are stronger than you think," he had said. She wanted to believe him. The next week brought rain, a blessing after the long dry spell. Margaret worked on the second load of mending that Jack had delivered, listened to the drops drum on the roof, and felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Rain meant her garden would flourish, meant water in the creek that bordered her property, meant the land might actually produce something worthwhile. She was hemming a pair of trousers when she heard horses approach through the rain. Multiple horses. Margaret set down her sewing and went to the window, her stomach clenching with anxiety when she saw 3 riders coming up the track. Not Jack this time, but ranch hands she did not recognize, wearing the brand of Blackwell's Double B Ranch. Margaret stepped onto the porch as the men rode into her yard. They did not dismount, just sat their horses in the rain, looking down at her with expressions that made her skin prickle with unease. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called, keeping her voice steady. The lead rider, a hard-faced man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Blackwell sent us to deliver a message." "What message would that be?" "He has increased his offer to $300 for your property. He says you have 1 week to accept before the offer is withdrawn permanently." "I already declined Mr. Blackwell's offer. My position has not changed." The scarred man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Mr. Blackwell thought you might say that. He also wanted us to mention that accidents tend to happen on isolated homesteads. Fires, mostly. Terrible thing, a fire. Can destroy everything a person has in minutes." Margaret's blood ran cold, but she lifted her chin. "Is that a threat?" "Just an observation, madam. You have a nice place here." Would be a shame if something happened to it. The three men sat there for a long moment, letting the threat sink in, then turned their horses and rode away without another word. Margaret stood on the porch long after they disappeared, rain soaking through her dress, fear and anger warring in her chest. She should be terrified, she knew. She was alone, isolated, and Blackwell clearly had no compunction about using intimidation to get what he wanted. But alongside the fear was a burning rage that men like Blackwell thought they could simply take what they wanted from people weaker than themselves. Margaret went inside, changed into dry clothes, then did something she had not done since Thomas died. She took down his old rifle from where it hung above the door, checked to make sure it was loaded, and propped it in the corner where she could reach it easily. She had never fired it, had no idea if she could actually shoot another human being if it came to that. But having it within reach made her feel fractionally less helpless. She finished the mending in a state of heightened awareness, jumping at every sound, relaxing only slightly when darkness fell without further incident. But sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain slow to a drizzle and then stop altogether. At first light, she saddled Rosie and rode for the Rockingham. The ranch was larger than she had imagined, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals. Cowboys were already at work despite the early hour, and one of them directed her to the bunkhouse where Jack was just emerging, tucking in his shirt. His face lit up when he saw her, then immediately creased with concern. "Margaret, what is wrong?" She dismounted, suddenly unsure what to say. In the light of day, with normal ranch activities going on around them, her midnight fears seemed almost foolish. But then she remembered the cold eyes of Blackwell's men, the casual way they had threatened everything she had, and the words spilled out. Jack's expression grew darker with every word. When she finished, his jaw was tight with barely suppressed anger. "Did they touch you? Threaten you physically?" "No. They just delivered Blackwell's message and left. But Jack, they talked about fires. They know I am alone out there. What if they come back? They will not." Jack took her hands, his grip firm and reassuring. "I am going to talk to Mr. Morrison, and then we are going to the sheriff. Blackwell has gone too far this time. Will the sheriff even care? Blackwell has money and influence. Sheriff Garrett is an honest man. He will care." Jack squeezed her hands. "And in the meantime, you are not going back to that homestead alone, not until we sort this out. Jack, I cannot just abandon my home. You are not abandoning it, but you are not staying there by yourself while Blackwell's men are making threats." He paused, clearly thinking through options. Mrs. Chen in town takes in boarders. Respectable place, clean, safe. You can stay there while we figure out what to do. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle herself, but the truth was, she was frightened. The thought of spending another night alone in the cabin, waiting for Blackwell's men to return, was more than she could bear. "All right," she said quietly, "but I need to go back for some things, and I need to secure the cabin and tend to the chickens. I will go with you. Let me tell Mr. Morrison what is happening." John Morrison, owner of the Rockingham, was a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to Jack's explanation, his expression growing grimmer by the moment. "Blackwell is a snake," he said flatly. "Always has been. Jack, you take Mrs. Parker into town, get her settled at Mrs. Chen's place, then come back here. I am going to have a conversation with some of the other ranch owners. Blackwell thinks he can bully people because he is rich, but there are limits to what we will tolerate." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said. "I do not want to cause trouble for anyone." "You are not causing trouble, my dear. Blackwell is, and it is high time someone stood up to him properly." Jack saddled a fresh horse, and they rode together back to Margaret's homestead. In daylight, with Jack beside her, the place looked less threatening, just a small rough cabin and a struggling garden. But Margaret could not shake the image of flames consuming it all, destroying the last tangible pieces of her life with Thomas. They worked quickly, gathering her essential belongings, making sure the chickens had food and water. Jack checked the cabin thoroughly, securing the windows and doors as best he could. "I will ride out here every day to check on things," he promised. "And I will spread the word to the other ranches to keep an eye out. If Blackwell's men come around, someone will see them." They rode into Opal together, and Jack helped Margaret get settled at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. The Chinese woman was brisk but kind, showing Margaret to a small, clean room on the second floor and explaining the house rules. Meals were provided twice a day, no male visitors above the ground floor, rent due weekly in advance. Jack paid for Margaret's first week over her protests. "Consider it an advance on the mending work," he said firmly. "You have already earned it." Then he accompanied her to the sheriff's office, a small building next to the jail on the edge of town. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a lean man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened to Margaret's account, taking notes, his expression growing more serious as she described the veiled threats. "Did they say anything explicitly threatening?" he asked when she finished. "They said accidents happen, fires especially." The implication was clear. Garrett nodded slowly. "I will have a talk with Blackwell, but Mrs. Parker, I need to be honest with you. Unless I catch his men in the act of doing something, there is not much I can charge them with. Delivering a message, even an unpleasant one, is not against the law. So he can threaten me with impunity." "I did not say that. I will make it clear to Blackwell that you are under the law's protection, and that any harm that comes to you or your property will be investigated thoroughly. Sometimes that is enough to make a man think twice." Garrett stood. "In the meantime, you did the right thing coming to town. Stay somewhere safe and public. That is your best protection." It was not the reassurance Margaret had hoped for, but it was something. Jack walked her back to the boarding house, his presence solid and comforting. "I have to get back to the ranch," he said when they reached the front steps. "But I will check on you tomorrow, and I will ride out to your place every day. Blackwell will not get away with this, Margaret. I promise you that. You have already done so much for me. I cannot ask you to risk yourself further. You are not asking, I am offering." He took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I care about what happens to you. I know it is too soon. I know you are still mourning Thomas, but I need you to know that. I care about you, Margaret Parker, and I will not stand by and let Blackwell or anyone else hurt you." Margaret looked up at him, her heart beating fast. The intensity in his eyes, the warmth of his hand holding hers, the simple honesty of his words, all combined to make her feel things she had thought were buried with Thomas. It was confusing and frightening and somehow wonderful all at once. "I care about you too, Jack," she heard herself say. "More than I probably should. More than I know how to handle. You do not have to handle anything right now. Just know that you are not alone." He left then, and Margaret went inside feeling unsteady and overwhelmed. The room Mrs. Chen had given her was Spartan but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk beneath the window. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, then sat on the bed and let herself cry for the first time in weeks. She cried for Thomas, and the life they had planned, for the homestead that might be lost, for the fear and uncertainty of her situation. But somewhere beneath the grief and anxiety was something else, something new and fragile. The possibility that life might hold more than just survival. That she might have a future worth imagining. The days that followed settled into a strange new routine. Margaret took her meals with the other boarders, a mix of single working women and traveling salesmen, and spent her days doing mending work that Jack brought from the Rocking M and other ranches in the area. Word had spread that she did excellent work, and she found herself with more commissions than she could easily handle. True to his word, Jack visited every day, sometimes just for a few minutes to let her know that her homestead was secure, sometimes staying longer to share a meal or walk with her through town. Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both pleased and unsettled her. "I should still be in mourning," she told Mrs. Chen one evening, helping the older woman with the dinner dishes. "It has only been 4 months since Thomas died. But when Jack is here, I forget to feel sad." Mrs. Chen, who had been widowed herself for over a decade, gave her a knowing look. "Grief is not forgetting to love the dead. Grief is learning to live again. Your husband would not want you to spend your life alone, wearing black and being miserable." "How can you be sure? You never met Thomas." "I have been widowed longer than you were married, child. I know what it is like to lose a husband, and I know that love is not a finite resource. Loving someone new does not diminish what you felt for the one who is gone." Margaret pondered this as she dried the plates and put them away. Her feelings for Jack were different from what she had felt for Thomas. Thomas had been her childhood sweetheart, safe and familiar, someone she had drifted into loving more than chosen actively. Jack was something else entirely, exciting and slightly dangerous, making her feel alive in ways she had not experienced before. It had been 2 weeks since she moved into the boarding house when Sheriff Garrett came to see her. His expression was grave, and Margaret's stomach dropped. "What happened? Is it my homestead?" "No, madam. Your place is fine, but I need to tell you something." Garrett took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I had that talk with Blackwell like I promised. He denied sending men to threaten you, said it must have been a misunderstanding." "That is a lie." "I know it is. But without witnesses or proof, there is not much I can do officially." Garrett paused. "However, I also need to tell you that Blackwell has filed a legal claim suggesting that your homestead improvements do not meet the requirements for proving up on the claim. He is arguing that without a man working the land, the homestead should be declared abandoned and opened for new claims." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "He cannot do that. Thomas and I met all the requirements. We lived on the land, made improvements, filed all the proper paperwork." "I know. And I think when it comes to court the judge will agree with you, but it is going to be a fight, Mrs. Parker. Blackwell is not giving up." After Garrett left, Margaret sat in her room feeling numb. No matter what she did, Blackwell seemed determined to take her land. Even if she won in court, the legal fees would likely bankrupt her, and if she lost, she would have nothing. There was a knock on her door and Mrs. Chen's voice called, "Mrs. Parker, you have a visitor downstairs." Margaret composed herself and went down to find Jack waiting in the parlor, his hat in his hands and concern written across his face. "Sheriff Garrett told me about Blackwell's claim," he said as soon as they were alone. "Margaret, I am so sorry. It is not your fault." "I know, but I feel responsible somehow. If I had not confronted him that day in town, maybe he would not be pushing so hard. Blackwell was after my land before you and I ever met. This is not on you." Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I just do not know what to do anymore. Even if I win this legal battle, there will be another and another. He will not stop until he gets what he wants." Jack sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Then we need to make sure he cannot get what he wants. We need to make your claim unassailable." "How?" "I am a widow working the land alone. That is exactly what he is arguing makes the homestead invalid." "What if you were not alone?" Jack's voice was quiet but intense. "What if you had a husband again, a working partner who could help prove up the claim?" Margaret stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I think we should get married." He held up a hand before she could respond. "I know it is fast. I know you are still grieving Thomas. And I know this is not exactly the romantic proposal a woman dreams of. But Margaret, I care about you. I have cared about you since that first day I gave you a ride home from town. And I think, given time, we could build something real together. You would marry me to save my homestead. I would marry you because I want to. The homestead is important, yes, but you are more important. I want to wake up in that cabin with you, work that land with you, build a life with you. If that also happens to solve your legal problems with Blackwell, then that is just practical good sense." Margaret's mind was spinning. Marriage. To Jack, a man she had known for less than a month, no matter how much she had come to care for him. It was madness, impulsive and reckless, and completely at odds with the careful, cautious life she had always lived. And yet, she thought of the ring on her finger, the one Jack had bought back for her. She thought of his kindness, his steady presence, the way he made her feel safe and valued. She thought of the alternative, losing everything Thomas had worked for, being forced to sell to Blackwell or give up and go back east defeated. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it would have to be a real marriage, not just a legal arrangement. I could not live like that, sharing a name but nothing else." Jack's face lit up with hope and something deeper. "I would not want it any other way. And you need to know that I am not sure I can love you the way you deserve. Not yet, maybe not ever. My heart is still broken in places I do not know how to fix. I know. And I am not asking you to love me right now. I am asking you to give us a chance to figure out what we could be together." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Marry me, Margaret. Let me help you save your home. Let me stand beside you against Blackwell and anyone else who tries to take what is yours. And maybe, if we are lucky, we can find something good in all this hardship." Margaret looked at their joined hands, at the wedding ring Thomas had given her and Jack had returned to her. This man was offering her everything she needed, asking for nothing in return but a chance. How could she say no? "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Jack's smile was like sunrise, bright and transforming. He pulled her up from her chair and into his arms, holding her close while she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. This was happening. She was going to marry Jack Sullivan, and together they were going to fight for the life she and Thomas had started. They were married 3 days later in the small church at the edge of Opal, with Sheriff Garrett and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, gray silk that had belonged to her mother, and carried wildflowers that Jack had picked that morning. He stood beside her in a new shirt, his hair still damp from being washed, and spoke his vows in a voice that shook slightly with emotion. "I, Jack Sullivan, take you, Margaret Parker, to be my wife. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, to work alongside you, to protect you, and to honor you all the days of my life." Margaret repeated her own vows, her voice stronger than she had expected. "I, Margaret Parker, take you, Jack Sullivan, to be my husband. I promise to build a life with you, to be your partner and your friend, and to face whatever comes with courage and honesty." The minister pronounced them married, and Jack kissed her gently, his lips warm and soft against hers. It was different from kissing Thomas, more tentative but somehow more intense, and when they parted, Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, though she was not sure if they were from sadness or joy or some complicated mixture of both. The small gathering afterward at Mrs. Chen's boarding house was cheerful but brief. John Morrison from the Rocking M attended, along with several ranch hands who worked with Jack, and they toasted the new couple with coffee and cake that Mrs. Chen had baked specially. "You did good, Jack," Morrison said, shaking his former ranch hand's hand. "And Mrs. Sullivan, you got yourself a fine man. He is one of the best I have ever had working for me." "Former ranch hand." Margaret looked at Jack in confusion. "What does he mean, former?" Jack had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I gave my notice yesterday. I cannot work for the Rockingham and also work our homestead. Our land needs a full-time farmer, and I intend to be that. Our land. Our homestead." The words made something warm bloom in Margaret's chest. For the first time since Thomas died, she was not facing the world alone. They rode out to the homestead together as the sun was setting, Jack on his bay and Margaret on Rosie, with a pack horse carrying Jack's belongings and supplies they had purchased in town. The cabin looked just as Margaret had left it, a little worn and weather-beaten but still standing, and as they approached, the chickens came running out to greet them with expectant clucks. Jack tended the horses while Margaret went inside to light the lamps. The cabin seemed different somehow, charged with new possibility. This was no longer just her and Thomas's space, haunted by memories and loss. This was going to be her and Jack's home, a place to build something new. When Jack came inside, carrying his saddlebags and bedroll, he paused in the doorway. "Where would you like me to put my things?" Margaret understood what he was really asking. Where would he sleep? Would she welcome him into her bed immediately, or did she need more time? She took a breath, steadying herself. "We are married, Jack. Your things go wherever you want them to go." He set his bags down carefully, then crossed to where she stood by the table. "Margaret, I want to be clear about something. I know this marriage happened quickly, for practical reasons as much as personal ones. I am not going to pressure you into anything you are not ready for. We can take things as slowly as you need." The consideration in his voice, the respect for her feelings, made Margaret's decision easier. "I appreciate that. But Jack, you were right when you said this needed to be a real marriage. I do not want to live like strangers who happen to share a house." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "I want to try to build something real with you. Starting tonight." Jack covered her hand with his own, turning his head to press a kiss into her palm. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Margaret let herself fall into it, into the warmth and strength of him. It was different from what she had known with Thomas, more passionate and less predictable. And when Jack lifted her and carried her to the bedroom, she went willingly, ready to start this new chapter of her life. Later, lying in the darkness with Jack's arm around her and his steady breathing in her ear, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief and loss, the fear and uncertainty, the unexpected kindness that had transformed into something more. She still missed Thomas, would always carry a piece of that loss with her. But she was beginning to understand what Mrs. Chen had meant about grief being learning to live again. She was living again. With Jack Sullivan, in this rough cabin in Montana, building a future one day at a time. The next morning, they woke early and began the work of proving to Blackwell and anyone else watching that the Sullivan homestead was very much an active, thriving claim. Jack repaired the fence posts Margaret had struggled with, reinforced the barn, and began plans for expanding the chicken coop. Margaret tended her garden, now flourishing from the recent rains, and continued taking in mending work to bring in cash income. A week after their marriage, they rode into town together to file the necessary paperwork, recording their union and Jack's addition to the homestead claim. The land office clerk processed the forms without comment, but Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes. News of their marriage would reach Blackwell soon enough. Sure enough, 2 days later, Cyrus Blackwell himself rode out to the homestead. Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw him coming, and she called for Jack, who emerged from the barn with a hammer still in his hand. Blackwell dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the obvious improvements to the property, the domestic scene of Margaret and Jack working together. Sullivan. Mrs. Sullivan. He nodded to each of them in turn. I heard about your marriage. Congratulations. Thank you, Jack said evenly, moving to stand beside Margaret. What brings you out here, Blackwell? I wanted to withdraw my legal claim regarding the homestead. It appears I was misinformed about the property's status. Blackwell's smile did not reach his eyes. A married couple actively working the land clearly meets all homesteading requirements. We appreciate you acknowledging that, Margaret said, keeping her voice calm despite the triumphant feeling rising in her chest. However, I also wanted to make one final offer, $500 for the property. That is more than generous for 160 acres of marginal land. The land is not for sale, Blackwell, Jack said flatly. Not now, not ever. This is our home and we intend to make it prosper. Blackwell's expression hardened. You are making a mistake, Sullivan. This land is not suitable for farming. A few good years and you will be lucky to break even, let alone make a profit. Then I guess that is our mistake to make. Jack's hand found Margaret's, their fingers interlacing. Now, if you will excuse us, we have work to do. Blackwell stared at them for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so thoroughly. Finally, he mounted his horse with sharp, angry movements. When you fail, do not come crying to me. My generosity has limits. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving dust hanging in the air. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Do you think that is really the end of it? I do. Blackwell is many things, but he is not stupid. He knows when he is lost. Jack squeezed her hand. We did it, Margaret. We saved your homestead. Our homestead, she corrected, and the smile he gave her was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty she had endured. The summer passed in a blur of hard work and small victories. Jack's knowledge of ranching and farming proved invaluable, and together they began to transform the struggling homestead into something genuinely productive. They expanded the garden, added more chickens, and purchased a pair of pigs with money saved from Margaret's mending work. Jack repaired the cabin roof, built a proper chicken coop, and started clearing land for a larger crop next spring. Through it all, Margaret found herself falling in love with her husband. Not the safe, comfortable love she had felt for Thomas, but something fiercer and more complex. She loved the way Jack sang while he worked, off-key but enthusiastic. She loved his dry sense of humor and the way he asked her opinion on every decision, treating her as a true partner. She loved how he held her at night, protective but not possessive, and the way he kissed her each morning before heading out to work. One evening in late September, they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Margaret was mending a shirt while Jack carved a new handle for a hoe, their movements comfortable and synchronized after months of working side by side. I have been thinking, Jack said, not looking up from his carving. This place needs a proper name. Every good homestead has one. What did you have in mind? I thought maybe Second Chance Ranch. Seems fitting given how we both found new beginnings here. Margaret set down her sewing, considering. I like that. Second Chance Ranch. It feels right. Jack looked up then, his eyes warm. There is something else I have been thinking about. I know when we married, you said you were not sure you could love me. I told you I was fine with that I just wanted a chance. But Margaret, I need to tell you now that I love you, completely and without reservation. You do not have to say it back, but I needed you to know. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Jack Sullivan, you are the kindest, most patient man I have ever known, and I do love you. I think I have for a while now, I just was not ready to admit it. I was afraid it somehow meant I had forgotten Thomas, or that I was being disloyal to his memory. And now I understand that hearts are bigger than we think. I love Thomas and I always will, but I love you too, differently but just as truly. You gave me my life back when I thought I had lost everything. How could I not love you for that? Jack set aside his carving and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. Say it again. I love you, Jack Sullivan. Again, I love you. Margaret laughed, the sound free and joyful. I love you, I love you, I love you. That winter was hard, as all Montana winters were, but Margaret and Jack faced it together, secure in their snug cabin with their stores of food and their growing love. They spent the long, dark evenings reading aloud from the books Jack had borrowed from the Rockingham Library, planning improvements for the spring, and learning each other's stories. Jack told her about growing up poor in Missouri, about watching his parents slowly work themselves to death trying to farm land that would not cooperate, about the responsibility he had felt for his younger sister Sarah after they died, and the relief when she married well, and he knew she would be cared for. Margaret shared her own history, the comfortable childhood in Cincinnati, the shock of adjusting to frontier life, the slow realization that she had been trying to live Thomas's dream rather than finding her own. With Jack, she was discovering what her own dreams looked like. I want children, she told him one snowy night in January. I always thought I would have them with Thomas, but he died before that could happen. But I still want them if you do. I want everything with you, Jack said, pulling her close. Children, grandchildren, a life that lasts until we are old and gray. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought abundance. The garden flourished, the chickens laid prolifically, and the pigs grew fat and healthy. Jack and Margaret worked from dawn to dusk, and slowly, gradually, the homestead began to actually turn a profit. In May, Margaret realized she had missed her monthly courses. By June, there was no doubt. She was pregnant. Jack's face when she told him was a picture of joy and terror mixed together. A baby. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Margaret asked, suddenly uncertain. Happy, Margaret, I am terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed. This is everything I have ever wanted. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. A family. A real family of our own. The pregnancy was easier than Margaret had feared, and Jack was endlessly solicitous, insisting she rest more and do less heavy work. Margaret endured his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. In the fall, with the harvest in and winter preparations complete, Margaret went into labor. Mrs. Chen came out from town to attend her, along with the doctor, and after 12 hours of hard work, Margaret delivered a healthy baby boy. Jack cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face. He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe this is my life. What should we name him? Margaret asked, exhausted but happy. Jack looked down at the baby, then at Margaret. I was thinking, Thomas, if you are amenable, after your first husband, he should be remembered. Margaret felt her own tears start. Are you sure? I do not want you to feel like you are in his shadow. I am not. But he was part of your journey to me, and he deserves to be honored. Besides, Thomas is a good, strong name. So they named their son Thomas Jack Sullivan, and he grew up healthy and strong on Second Chance Ranch, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Sarah, after Jack's sister, and then another son they called Matthew. The years passed in a blur of hard work, laughter, and love. The homestead prospered beyond anything Margaret and Thomas had imagined, and eventually they were able to purchase additional land, expanding their holdings. Jack proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and the Sullivan horses became known throughout Montana for their quality and temperament. Cyrus Blackwell's fortunes, meanwhile, went the opposite direction. Bad investments and drought years left him overextended, and eventually he was forced to sell the Double B ranch to pay his debts. He left Montana a bitter, broken man, and Margaret found she could feel nothing but pity for him. On their 10th anniversary, Jack surprised Margaret with a gift. It was a new wedding ring, this one set with a small diamond that glittered in the lamplight. "The original ring will always be special," he said, slipping the new band onto her finger alongside the plain gold one. "It represents where you came from and everything you survived. But I wanted you to have something that represents where we are now, what we have built together." Margaret looked at the two rings, old and new, past and present, and felt her heart swell with contentment. "I love it, I love you, and I love you, every day more than the last." They stood together on the porch of their cabin, now expanded and improved but still fundamentally the same structure Thomas had built all those years ago. Their children played in the yard, their voices bright with laughter. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, and the Montana sky stretched wide and blue overhead. Margaret thought about the desperate woman she had been, selling her wedding ring just to eat, convinced her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who had bought it back and slipped it onto her finger, offering her a second chance at happiness. And she thought about all the moments in between, the hard work and love and determination that had transformed both of them. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, his arm warm around her waist. "How lucky I am, how blessed we are. We made our own luck, you and I. We chose each other and chose to fight for this life." "The best choice I ever made," Margaret said, standing on her toes to kiss him. As the sun set over Second Chance Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Margaret Parker Sullivan stood with her husband and watched their children play, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The grief and loss that had nearly destroyed her had instead led her to a love deeper and more profound than she had imagined possible. The ring Thomas had given her, and Jack had returned, still circled her finger, a reminder of all she had survived. But beside it gleamed the new ring, symbol of everything she had found. Together, they told the story of her life, of loss and love, of endings and new beginnings, of a widow who sold her wedding ring and a cowboy who bought it back, and in doing so, gave her not just the ring but a whole new life. Years later, when Margaret was old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she would tell the story of how she and Jack fell in love. How he had appeared when she needed him most, how he had fought for her and with her, how they had built something beautiful out of hardship and hope. And always at the end of the story, she would hold up her left hand, showing the two rings that never left her finger. "This one," she would say, touching the plain gold band, "represents the past I honored, and this one, touching the diamond ring, represents the future we built. Together, they are my most precious possession, because they tell the story of how love can come twice in a lifetime if you are brave enough to open your heart again." Jack would smile and take her hand, pressing a kiss to her weathered knuckles, and their family would gather close, warmed by the love that still burned bright between the widow and the cowboy who had saved each other on a Montana homestead all those years ago. The end.